With the best all-inclusive vacation deals to Mexico and the Caribbean, booking your getaway with Cheap Caribbean Vacations means you have more freedom to do your deal. Whether you want to enjoy snorkeling, endless margaritas and more, or simply soak up the sun and sand in a tropical paradise, Cheap Caribbean Vacations has your deal for that. Plan and book the exact way you want at exactly the right price for you by using our exclusive Budget Beach Finder. Or find a featured all-inclusive package to Blue Diamond Resorts and do your deal at cheapcaribbean.com.
PayPal lets you pay all your pals, like your graduation gifters.
Who's paying for the mattress topper?
You mean the beanbag chair?
Aren't we getting a mini fridge?
Can we create a pool on PayPal? It lets us collect the money before we buy.
Ooh, yes, that's smart.
Glad we can agree on something.
Easily pool, split, and send money with PayPal. Get started in the PayPal app. A PayPal account is required to send and receive money. A balance account is required to create a pool.
This week, we're doing something different before we get back to our regularly scheduled programming here at Crimelines. This is an interview I did with the host of the Truer Crime podcast. And it's a podcast that I really highly recommend, which is why I'm doing this. I often get contacted by other podcasters trying to do promo swaps or an interview or something promotional to kind of help their show out. And I like to help shows out when I can. I am only where I am because other shows like The Generation Y pulled me out of obscurity ages ago. So I like to pay it forward, but I can't have everyone who contacts me on the show, and I don't always have time to listen to their podcast first to make sure that it is even something I would want to promote. So I don't always have the opportunity to do these. And I also know my show's format is an interview. So when I do these, it's because I found something special. And with Truer Crime, I absolutely found that. You'll hear in my conversation that I assumed that this was a newsroom type production from a seasoned journalist. That is how good it is. The storytelling, the sound design, it is such an incredible podcast. So I'm glad she got to me when I had time to try a new podcast and see if it would be a good fit for promoting on the show. And I was like, immediately, yes, let's get this done. So here is my interview. And while you're listening, go find Truer Crime in your favorite podcast app. I would like to welcome my guest to the show. I want you to go ahead and tell me a little bit about your background and your podcast.
Yeah, so I'm Celicia Stanton. I am from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I am the creator and host of Truer Crime. I also host another show called The Vanishing Point, which it released as a part of Tenderfoot TV in 2023. But Truer Crime was how I got into podcasting, and it was kind of very random. I'm a wedding and portrait photographer and had been for many years, kind of just right out of college. And I never thought I would end up in podcasting. But in 2020, with everything that was going on with the pandemic, obviously not a lot of events going on, didn't have a lot of weddings to photograph. And so I found myself with a lot more free time in my hands. And being from Minneapolis, like I mentioned, the murder of George Floyd was had such a big impact on my community, obviously on the global community, but especially right here in the city. That was something, the uprising and sort of like the activism that followed, that was something that I was a part of and was kind of really close to home. And I ended up posting a lot of social and racial justice content on my Instagram account at the time, and found that a lot of kind of my perspective on those issues was resonating with folks, and ended up having a few different posts go viral and kind of grew a platform on Instagram. And I kind of realized, people have some interest in like my perspective as a Black woman living in the Midwest, having gay parents, all these different things that sort of like factor into who I am and how I see the world. And so I knew I wanted to do something with that, but didn't know what that would look like longer term. I always felt like social media was a bit too like black and white and unnuanced for me. I'm a little bit long-winded. I did debate in high school. I coached debate for over 10 years. I love to like get into the messy details of things. And so I knew that would be on some other platform, but didn't know what that would be. And then sort of seemingly unrelated, later that same year in the summer of 2020, I started working with this financial advisor who, long story short, was actually defrauding all of his investor clients. So he stole all of the money I had invested with him.
Gosh.
And he actually stole over $2 million from all of his investor clients. He was a fiduciary, meaning that he was like an actual financial advisor with like extra legal responsibilities to do what was best for his clients. And he still obviously did this mostly to fund personal lifestyle things. And so this is a very like unexpected sort of turn of events in my life, and really kind of in processing all of that. It was like the December-ish of 2020 now when I kind of had found out all this had happened. He had turned himself into the FBI. Like the FBI had been investigating him, and there was this whole criminal legal process that started. He pled guilty and was convicted to a prison sentence, which is where he is now. But in the aftermath of that crime for me, I was just kind of reeling from all of that. And also it's winter in Minnesota, not a lot going on. It's freezing cold outside. I'm just like doing cat puzzles at my house and listening to true crime podcasts like all day long. That was my coping mechanism. And basically in listening to so much true crime, I was constantly pausing it and kind of talking to my husband, who I actually met in debate. So we love having these sort of like critical discussions. And so I would just be pausing it and like complaining to him about things that I felt like were missing. You know, I just felt like there's never any discussions of race or gender or sexuality. Mm-hmm. There was never any discussion of like, why do these crimes happen? And, you know, like, how do we actually keep folks safe? And, you know, so I did enough of these sort of rants to him that he was kind of like, well, why don't you start your own show? And so for me, it felt like this perfect converging of like wanting to do more related to like kind of my perspective in that longer form format. And I always have loved podcasts, but in this format of true crime storytelling, which I think is obviously very interesting, addictive, it can be entertaining in its arc and format, which, you know, I think that any good story is entertaining. With the key is, can you have the takeaway from that story be something that is positive for the world? And that was something I felt like I could do if I did my own show. So I ended up coming out with season 1 of True Crime in the spring of 2021. And yeah, that's how I got here.
So how did you get from sitting at home thinking about a true crime podcast to being connected with Tenderfoot TV?
Yeah. So I honestly, like I said, I had no background in this. It was just kind of pulling things together based on what I had heard and just seeing if these episodes would resonate with people, and just kind of serendipitously an agent had come across the few episodes into the season. And we weren't, I mean, especially when we first came out, it wasn't like we were really in the charts. Like there was like, I think quickly sort of like a loyal following that started kind of like listening and feeling like like what they felt like was missing in the genre was kind of answered with the show. But it wasn't like at all like the show was some immediate success. And so I don't know exactly how it fell into their hands, but they ended up hearing the show, setting up a few meetings for me. And that's how I ended up getting in contact with Tenderfoot TV and the folks over there. And then ended up kind of bringing it on board, their slate of shows. I liked that they had a lot of other shows that kind of tackled some of this similar social issues of significance. And I also loved how their show sounded because, you know, being a show that was independently produced and I'm self-funding, it's like, there's no sound design, there's no like super high quality production. And I always have felt like, you know, good storytelling can really be amplified by the right music and, you know, great production and good equipment and all of that. But that's just something I didn't have the skills to do on my own. So that was exciting, is that I felt like sonically, like all of their episodes just sounded so great and it made people connect to those stories more.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I have been listening to your second season and you can hear that, like the elevated polish. But something that kind of surprises me with you saying, oh, I have no background in this, is that your narration and your writing is so polished.
Thank you.
So I think my listeners, you know, they're like, oh, she started this at her house like I did. Like my narration is just me talking. But like yours is just that elevated where you feel connected to it. You don't sound like you're reading from a script. You don't sound like you're reporting the news, but it's also just that step above. And I loved it. So I was definitely a fan from the first episode I listened to.
Thank you. That's very sweet.
One of the questions I was wondering is, you know, you're talking about this social justice tilt to what you're doing. But so how do you find cases to cover? And then what is the criteria that has you say, yes, I'm going to cover this?
Yeah. So for me, it was always really important from the beginning that I cover all types of cases. I wanted to do episodic true crime, different story every week, because I felt like that was where there was a lot of room for nuance. I think if you're going to do like a limited series where you're covering one case over a series of episodes, that's obviously super important and needed, but there's a lot more time to delve into the nuances and explore those pieces of a case. And so I felt like, with episodic true crime, there's just like a lot of room for like, kind of just, maybe you just like are pulling what you read off of Wikipedia, or you don't have the time, right? There's so many constraints around like researching deeply. So I was like, what would it look like to sort of bridge this gap between the deep dive of a limited series with the sort of like there's so many benefits to episodic too. You can just like get more publicity for so many important stories. And so I wanted to do that, but then I also wanted to do all different kinds of stories that I didn't want to limit myself. I felt like, I never wanted to be known as the social justice podcast or the history podcast or the true crime podcast that's hosted by a Black woman, because there's not so many of them, right? I wanted to be a true crime podcast, and I really wanted to be a part of this, greater movement of shifting the genre that I think, a lot of true crime podcasts now too are like, there's, so many others that I really admire, like yours, that I feel like are doing really important work and kind of, put that sort of like ethical storytelling at the forefront of what they're doing. But, I was like, in order to kind of be amongst everybody else, you have to cover the types of stories that everyone else is going to cover. So for me, sometimes I'm doing infamous stories that a lot of people think they know. For example, in season 1, I did an episode on Jonestown, which is a case that I feel like a lot of people feel familiar with. Maybe they've even heard like the line, like, don't drink the Kool-Aid, right? But a lot of folks don't know that the majority of the people who died in Guyana were Black women, Black folks more generally, but especially Black women, that, Jim Jones was really seen as a fighter for racial and class equity. And, the Black Panthers supported him. He had all these sort of alliances with, actual great civil rights and Black power organizations. And, those were parts, like an angle to the story that I was so unfamiliar with, or for example, in this season, we're going to be putting out an episode. It might be out when this comes out. A 2-part episode on the Manson murders, another super infamous case. Most folks don't know that, Manson was actually trying to incite a race war, that he tried to pin multiple of his crimes on the Black Panthers. And then, I also like to do stories that are maybe more considered. They typically get relegated to like history. They're not typically covered on true crime and true crime media. So like in this season, one of the first episodes we did was on the assassination of Martin Luther King, which, might be, if you ask people, they might know like a thing or two about Martin Luther King's assassination. Like, oh yeah, he was killed by, a guy who was ultimately convicted, or he was killed on a balcony at a motel. And that's true. He was killed on a balcony at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. And the man that was convicted for doing that was James Earl Ray. He pled guilty and ultimately was convicted and sentenced to 99 years in prison. A lot of folks don't know that in 1999, Coretta Scott King, King's wife, alongside her children, sued a multitude of people, including entities of the United States government, saying that they were involved in a conspiracy to kill King. And in fact, Coretta Scott King won that civil trial, which is crazy, right? Because that wasn't that long ago. And so it was like, what would it look like if I told stories that are considered history, gave them the true crime treatment? I felt like we could reach a lot more people. I feel like there's not normally a lot of crossover. The true crime girlies aren't listening to the history podcast. The history buffs aren't listening necessarily to the true crime stuff. So I wanted to, kind of give it that true crime treatment. Or like, for example, in season 1, I covered the Tulsa Race Massacre. So similarly, these are stories of historical significance, but they have compelling sort of true crime elements to them. They are true crime cases. And then, of course, I love to cover cases that are just more typical cases that are covered on lots of different shows. One of the episodes that we put out recently was about Lauren McCluskey, a young woman who was killed by her ex-boyfriend after she repeatedly reported his sort of like abuse and harassment to police. And then, finally, I really like to try to do some cases that really kind of like flip on its head this idea of like victim or perpetrator. I think that like it's really easy in true crime media to fall into this pattern of like, okay, yes, there was the like evil, bad perpetrator, and then there was this innocent, beautiful victim. And it's oftentimes to the truer crime of it all, more complex than that. And so one of the cases or the episode of True Crime that just came out last week was about Alice Sebold, who is the author of The Lovely Bones, a really popular novel that was adapted to a movie that I really loved as a teenager. And a lot of folks might not know that her first book, Alice Sebold's first book, was called Lucky. It's a memoir about her own assault in college and the subsequent trial and conviction of her attacker, who she identified by seeing him out on the street one day. And the man that was convicted in that trial was Anthony Broadwater. And what ended up happening, what we actually found out just a few years ago, was that Anthony Broadwater was wrongfully convicted. He spent 16 and a half years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Alice Sebold was attacked. She did endure this really brutal assault. She just misidentified him. And that's a very common phenomenon, especially cross-racially, which was the situation here. And so for me with a story like that, it's like, who is the victim? Who is the perpetrator? It's confusing. It's messy. It opens these really complicated questions. And so that's always, I think, too, the goal with any of the stories I pick is, can we really hit at themes that feel true to life? And can we open up conversation and dialogue between people to like really think more critically about these stories that they're consuming?
I learned a lot of things growing up, but unfortunately, money matters were not one of them. It meant I had very little clue of what I was doing and made mistakes that took literal years to undo. Obviously, that's not something I want my own kids to go through, but not knowing how to teach them has been an issue. You've heard me talk about Acorns Early before, and I want to thank them again for sponsoring the show because this is an incredible tool for parents that I wish I had years ago. Acorns Early is a smart money app and debit card for kids that helps them learn the value of money. Acorns Early has a chore tracker that teaches kids that hard work pays off. You just set up chores in the app, set a payment amount, and tick it off when it's done. Acorns Early lets parents pay allowances automatically so you're not having to rummage around for cash. And the kids can spend what they earn with their very own debit card. They're going to love not just the sense of independence, but getting to choose from over 35 customizable card designs. Plus, parents can keep track of where and when their kids are spending. You get real-time spend notifications and can even set limits. But for me, the greatest thing about the Acorns Early app is that they have a bunch of fun interactive courses that help kids learn about all things money. So are you ready to help your kids learn the value of money? Just head to acornsearly.com/crimelines or download the Acorns Early app to get started. Sign up now and your first month is on us. Terms and conditions apply. Monthly subscription fee starting from $5 per month unless canceled.
You know what's funny about fitness? When you do it right, it's hard for about 20 minutes a day, but the rest of your life feels easy. When you don't do that hard 20 minutes, well, pretty soon your whole life feels hard. I even saw an ad the other day for a workout that you do in a chair. I mean, who are they kidding? I'm not trying to be more fit when I'm on the couch. I'm trying to be strong and healthy doing real life. So I follow Body programs. That's Body with an I. Each program is professionally designed and shows you how to get fast results step by step. Since I know I want to feel good for the rest of my life, I committed to a 1-year subscription and cut the price from over $1 a day down to less than 50 cents a day. This is how you take care of yourself and have a body that you love, that will love you back from your 40s through your 80s. It's time to love your body. Go to body.com and sign up now. That's body with an I.com.
I have regularly come across cases where I'm like, ooh, this is making me uncomfortable. There's a gray area here. I don't know if you've ever, a man named Bob Dow was killed in Texas by two young women. I don't even know that both of them were out of their teen years at the time, and they went on the run, and it was very dramatic. It gets a lot of dramatic true crime treatment because it's sensational. They were in apparently a relationship as well. But when you kind of pull back, what happened is, yes, they killed Bob Dow, but Bob Dow had been sexually exploiting both of them. He was abusing his mother, who was bedridden. He was not a good person. And exploring that idea of not a perfect victim. I felt when I started my podcast that a lot of people were avoiding those conversations because they're difficult to have. And I think that Alice Sebold one is such a good example because how many times, like, if we talk about a rape case, we're talking about his word versus her word. Now, they were both telling the truth. She was mistaken in who did it, but she had been attacked. So we have two people who had been victimized. And how do you tell that story with that nuance of two victimized people telling their stories? So I thought your coverage of that was very good. I knew the story, and I've read Lovely Bones. I've never seen the movie. The story was absolutely haunting. And I didn't know that she had another book. I didn't know how the attack and then the subsequent exoneration had influenced any of her writing, because it seems like it first inspired her to write, and then with the exoneration, she almost couldn't write after that because she doesn't know what she realized how little she knows, and her own perspective. So I thought you handled that so well. And one of the cases I also listened to is, the Allenberg case has been on my list for a while. It keeps kind of getting bumped. I know you talk about that line between history and true crime, and I kind of come across that too. And I realize that there's only so many cases from the 80s and earlier that my audience really wants to hear. They do like the more recent ones. So, I kind of pick and choose when I do those older cases. I just did one on the Fall River Satanic Panic murders because one of the people is still saying he's wrongfully convicted and he's still in prison. So it's a relevant case to today. But why did you choose the Allenberg case to cover?
It's actually kind of a funny story because I had never heard of Allenberg, and it was just kind of suggested to me by someone on the Tenderfoot team because they had sort of looked into the story, had met a lot of the people who were connected to the case, who had known Alan personally, had conducted some interviews. So there was some interesting, just sort of primary source material that we had. And so it was maybe this might be a good fit for true crime, especially because, for folks who aren't familiar, Allenberg was a radio host who was sort of a provocateur. He was an original.
He was a shock jock.
Shock jock. Yeah, exactly. And he was very, very bold, and he would argue with white supremacists and, whoever wanted to argue with him on air. And he was actually targeted by a white supremacist group, neo-Nazi group called The Order, who ultimately ended up killing him outside of his home. And so originally I was kind of interested in it because I was great, we have this primary source material. I always like to try to, if we actually have interviews with people who were most closely connected, then I feel that's always something I want to kind of look into more. But I also felt there was this interesting angle around this group and kind of the types of stories that I like to tell on true crime. So I was sure, yeah, let's do this episode. And I started doing my research, and the very first thing, and I talk about this in the episode, that I come across is this kind of article that's sort of remembering this case years after the fact. And they're sort of just saying, there's these fresh reminders of this Allenberg assassination because of this shooting that has happened at the Holocaust Museum. And that really stood out to me because the shooting that they were referencing at the Holocaust Museum was a shooting I had been at. And I had been there as a student traveling to DC as a part of a school trip. And I was that's really wild because this is just a random connection to have. And I was also what is the connection? Why are they referencing this shooting at the Holocaust Museum and connecting it to the story of Allenberg? So that was really then drove my curiosity of wanting to know, what are the echoes of Allenberg's story that can still be seen today? And how is that framed through maybe my perspective as somebody who was, at the museum that day? And just, if folks haven't heard of this story, there was a white supremacist Holocaust denier who went into the Holocaust Museum and essentially basically started shooting from the moment he entered the museum during just normal business hours. And a security guard, Stephen Tyrone Johns, ended up being sadly killed, during his shooting rampage. After that, he was able to be sort of apprehended, brought to jail, and he died awaiting trial. Nobody else, thankfully, was injured that day. But just a really crazy experience that I had at 13 years old that was connected to a case that had never happened to me before. So it made it really interesting to kind of trace those threads through till today.
Today, with everything going on with anti-Semitism, it is a relevant story even through today. I live in Kansas City, and one of our suburbs has a Jewish community center where there was a shooting years ago. And to see these patterns repeat, it's useful to go back and tell the earlier stories so that we can see it and hopefully learn from it. Something else you do at the end of your episodes is you do calls to action where you're like, here, let me highlight some either resources or fundraisers or whatever you're looking to. How do you find those?
I normally, it's different depending on the episode. So like sometimes when we're doing an episode where we have a lot of interaction with family or victims or our victims like loved ones, we're able to sort of reach out to them and see like, how can we direct support to you? We did a lot of this, especially in season 1. And that's always great because I like to try to, the more specific we can be with our support, the better, I think. I also, try to mix in organizations that people can be a part of, either donate or volunteer for or connect with or get resources from that just kind of feel relevant to some of the main themes that we're exploring in an episode. So that kind of changes depending on what episode we're talking about. For me, it's always been really important that like, yes, this is, it's media. It's an entertainment medium in many ways, but also these stories have significance in our real lives and we can't just mindlessly consume them for our own entertainment. We need to go out and, do something, take action, and make it so that, these sorts of things don't continue happening. Right. So that's the goal with the action items and, kind of always just looking for different ways to point, to highlight organizations doing great work.
Yeah, I am glad that you have said now and earlier about true crime as entertainment because a lot of people get very defensive about that idea. But as I'm sure you've seen in your own work, if people are not interested, if what you're doing is not entertaining, they're not listening and they're not getting the lesson. It's the same as a college lecturer. World War II may not be, what we want to think of as entertainment, but if you're not interested because you're not being entertained enough, your brain's not being engaged enough, you're not going to listen through. And, to be able to inspire people, you have to do that. And I think you do it really well, where it never feels sensational on your show. It's just, but your narrative storytelling is just like a masterclass. And I just am like, how is this not your background? When I listened, I was like, oh, so she's a journalist who's now podcasting.
That's very like flattering.
100%. That was my assumption.
Yeah, no, I think it's just, maybe it's a little bit of the debate background too, having had done debate and coached it for a long time. But I think in a lot of ways, it's just, I've always liked telling stories through different mediums, whether it be photography or just kind of like my own writing projects and all of that. So, and also I've always just been a huge consumer of podcasts. I think that it's kind of funny how many people who work in podcasts will tell you they don't really listen to podcasts that often. That's not me at all. I am always listening to all the podcasts, true crime news, like whatever it is, like all the things. And so, it's just like, people who write books and who are like, yeah, you become a better writer by reading a lot. And I feel like for me, it's like taking a lot of inspiration from a lot of folks who've been doing this work for a long time.
I realize that most of the podcasts that I really connect to are not interview, but they tend to have like at least two hosts, and they're telling a story kind of back and forth. And I thought with my own podcast, I'm like, if I want to do that and I don't have a co-host, I have to kind of pretend my microphone is the co-host and that I'm like telling the story to the listener through, that way, and they're my co-host. And so, when I listen to more narratively crafted ones like yours or the Fall Line, I'm always like, oh man, I wish I could do that. But I'm like, I don't even know if I can do anything other than what I've been doing because I've been doing it for so long. But it would be interesting to try it on a different show, just try something a little bit more crafted than my, okay, here's what happened kind of storytelling.
And I think, the conversational piece of things is really great because I feel like that's what, especially with audio being such like an intimate medium, podcasting being such an intimate medium, I feel like that's why people love a conversational show too, where they really feel like they have a connection to the host. And, it's like, okay, you're sitting down with your friend talking about this case. and engaging with it in a deep way, which I think is another just really brilliant technique to get people interested in a story and want to engage with it beyond just listening to it. So I definitely think, all of it's important.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for giving me some of your time. And where can people find you? I mean, True or Crime on every podcast app, I assume. But where are you on social media if people want to connect there?
You can find True or Crime at True or Crime Pod on Instagram, Threads, X, all the things. And then you can find me at Celicia Stanton on Instagram and TikTok. Again, all the things. And then I also have a newsletter called Sincerely Celicia, which you can look at it and decide if you want to subscribe at sincerelycelicia.substack.com. And that's a little bit more like personality driven. I'll do like little reflections and essays. Sometimes they're political, sometimes they're more sociological. Sometimes they're just like random things I'm thinking about, cultural commentary, but then it's just a lot of like recommendations, the podcasts I'm loving, the books I'm reading, the things I'm cooking. So we're definitely a lot of times tying in true crime stories and stuff to that as well, but it's just a little bit more personality driven. But yeah. So
you sound very busy.
I know.
Managing all those platforms.
I know. You trying to do it all, and succeeding sometimes.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. This is great.